Welcome to Play Me to Sleep. Tonight, we are going to tell you about a man who had more power than almost any human being who has ever lived, and who spent every single day of his reign trying not to be corrupted by it. A man who buried 9 of his children and still found reasons to be grateful. A man who led armies across frozen rivers and through plague-ravaged provinces while secretly writing, in a private notebook he never intended anyone to read, that he needed to be kinder, more patient, less easily annoyed. He was the ruler of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever produced. He was also, by his own honest account, a work in progress. His name was Marcus Aurelius. He was Emperor of Rome for 19 years. And the private thoughts he wrote down for no one but himself have now been read by more people than he could have imagined in his most expansive moment of philosophical speculation. This is his story, and it is one of the strangest, most moving, and most quietly extraordinary lives in the history of the world. To understand why this story matters, you need to picture the world he inhabited. Rome, in the year 161 AD, was the center of everything. More than 1 million people lived within its walls, making it the largest city on Earth by a considerable distance. The streets were narrow and loud and perpetually congested, filled with the smell of roasting bread and the sound of iron cartwheels on stone and the overlapping voices of 1 million people, all trying to get somewhere. Above the noise, the great marble temples rose against the pale Italian sky. Aqueducts carried mountain water directly into the city. Roads stretched outward in every direction, connecting an empire that reached from the rain-soaked coasts of Britain to the edge of the Sahara Desert. It was, by any measure of its age, a civilization of breathtaking scale and ambition. And Marcus Aurelius was now responsible for all of it. Every province, every legion, every legal dispute that worked its way up to the imperial court, every diplomatic letter, every grain shipment and every border crossing and every petition from every corner of the known world. He had not asked for any of it. It had found him anyway. We are going to follow his life from the beginning. From the quiet childhood of a boy who lost his father early and found philosophy young, through the long years of preparation for a throne he never sought, into the wars and plagues and betrayals of his reign, and all the way to his final winter on the frozen Danube frontier. We will meet the real Marcus Aurelius, not the marble statue, but the living, struggling, deeply human person behind it. We will read his private words, written in the dark hours when no one was watching, and discover what he was actually afraid of, what he was actually proud of, and what he was still, after all those years of effort, trying to get right. And we will ask the question his life keeps raising, quietly and persistently, across 20 centuries of history. What does it actually mean to try to be a good person? Not in easy times, not when the conditions are favorable, but when the weight of the world is pressing down on you and the temptations are real and the grief is genuine and the work never stops. So, settle in. Let the tensions of the day begin to dissolve and allow yourself to drift back through the centuries. Let us travel to ancient Rome, to the world of emperors and senators, of battle lines and philosophy, of a man who had everything and yet reached always for something more. Let us begin. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus was born on the 26th of April in the year 121 AD in Rome. His full name at birth was Marcus Annius Verus, and he came from a prosperous and politically connected family of Spanish origin. The Annii Veri were what Romans called a senatorial family, meaning they had accumulated enough wealth, influence, and reputation over generations to sit among the governing class of the empire. His grandfather, also named Marcus Annius Verus, had served 3 times as consul, the most prestigious elected office in the Roman system, and had been a close personal friend of the Emperor Hadrian. These were not people who lurked at the edges of Roman power. They were comfortable near its center, familiar with its workings, respected by those who controlled it, and accustomed to the peculiar mixture of privilege and obligation that came with belonging to Rome's ruling class. Marcus lost his father young, when he was just a few years old. His father, Annius Verus, died leaving behind a widow and 2 small children. The loss shaped Marcus in ways he would reflect on for the rest of his life, though the reflections are characteristically understated. He was raised primarily by his mother, Domitia Lucilla, and by his paternal grandfather, who stepped in with a thoroughness and warmth that Marcus would later describe with deep gratitude. His grandfather's second wife also played an important role in his upbringing. Marcus grew up in a household of multiple generations, surrounded by adults who took his education and character formation with great seriousness, who argued about ideas at the dinner table and read widely and expected the same from the children in their care. It was, by any measure, an environment of extraordinary intellectual richness, and Marcus absorbed it completely. Domitia Lucilla was herself a person of considerable substance. She was wealthy in her own right, the owner of tile factories that supplied building materials across the Roman world, and she was, by all accounts, a woman of intelligence, genuine piety, and moral seriousness that was not merely performed for social purposes. Marcus would later list among the things he was grateful for having learned from his mother her generosity, her simplicity in personal habits, despite her considerable wealth, and her religious devotion. These were not abstract virtues to him. He had watched her practice them daily, in the details of how she managed her household, how she treated her slaves, how she responded to requests from those who needed her help. They left marks that no amount of imperial luxury could subsequently erase, and that is exactly what Marcus was grateful for. The young Marcus showed an early aptitude that caught adult attention beyond his immediate family. The Emperor Hadrian, who was fond of the boy's grandfather and who regularly assessed the Roman aristocracy for future talent with the cool eye of a man who understood that empires run on capable people, noticed Marcus when he was still very young. Hadrian called him Verissimus, a playful adaptation of his family name that meant something like the most truthful, and seems to have used it as a term of affectionate teasing as well as genuine observation, coming from an emperor who prided himself on seeing through pretension and who valued directness and honesty above almost everything else in the people around him. It was a significant compliment. Hadrian enrolled the 6-year-old Marcus in the equestrian order, a rank of considerable social prestige, and clearly marked him as someone worth watching carefully as he grew. Those who knew him as a child remembered him as serious without being joyless, curious without being undisciplined, and possessed of a quality that Romans valued highly and called gravitas, a kind of steady, weighty seriousness of purpose that distinguished those born to lead from those who merely wanted to. He was good at wrestling and fond of boxing, and enjoyed hunting in the Roman aristocratic manner, on horseback with hounds, in the open countryside outside the city. He was also, even as a small boy, intensely interested in ideas in a way that went beyond what his tutors required of him. He asked questions that made the adults around him think. He read more than was required and sought out conversations with educated people who could tell him things he did not already know. The combination of physical vigor and intellectual appetite was one that Rome had always admired in its most capable men, and he had it in full measure. The education that followed was exceptional even by the high standards of Rome's upper class, which had its own elaborate and demanding expectations about what a properly formed young man should know. Marcus was taught at home by a succession of private tutors rather than being sent to the public schools that served most Roman children. His grandfather believed in hiring the best available minds, regardless of expense, and the household accounts show payments to a remarkable array of teachers covering grammar, rhetoric, literature, music, geometry, painting, and the arts of public speaking. Marcus learned Greek as thoroughly as Latin, which was considered essential for any serious intellectual engagement with the ancient world's philosophical tradition, almost all of which had been originally composed in Greek. He studied Homer with the careful attention that a later age would bring to scripture. He read the great Athenian tragedians. He learned to paint with enough skill that contemporaries took notice. But the encounter that would define his life happened when Marcus was around 12 years old. He came under the influence of a man named Diognetus, a philosopher and painter who introduced the boy to Stoic philosophy. The effect was immediate and lasting in a way that is striking even across the distance of 2,000 years. Marcus threw himself into the Stoic way of life with an intensity that surprised and genuinely alarmed everyone around him. He began sleeping on a hard board rather than his comfortable bed. He wore the rough cloak of a philosopher rather than his fine clothes. He stayed up late reading by lamplight and rose before dawn to continue his studies and his exercise. His mother worried about his health and apparently had considerable difficulty persuading him to sleep on a simple mattress as a compromise. The compromise, it seems, was eventually accepted. The impulse behind it never went away. Stoicism was a school of philosophy founded in Athens around 300 BC by a thinker named Zeno of Citium, who reportedly began his philosophical career after losing everything he owned in a shipwreck and finding himself adrift in a city he barely knew. He started listening to a bookseller reading aloud from Xenophon's account of Socrates, was immediately captivated, and asked where he could find men like Socrates in his own day. The reply pointed him toward the Cynics, and from there he developed his own more systematic philosophy. He taught in the Stoa Porcile, the painted porch that ran along one edge of the Athenian agora, and gave his school its name. Over 3 centuries of development and elaboration by brilliant thinkers including Chrysippus, Panaetius, and Posidonius, it had grown into a comprehensive way of understanding the world and one's place within it, one of the most fully developed philosophical systems the ancient world produced. At the core of the Stoic system was the belief that virtue defined as living in accordance with reason and nature, was the only true good, and that everything else, wealth, health, reputation, pleasure, pain, even life and death themselves, was ultimately neither good nor bad in itself, but only good or bad in relation to how we respond to it. The Stoics believed that we cannot control what happens to us, but can always control how we respond. This distinction between what is in our power and what is not became the cornerstone of everything else. For a sensitive boy who had already learned something about loss and uncertainty, who had grown up without a father, and in a world where everyone around him understood that fortune could turn without warning, this teaching must have felt like a revelation. It did not deny the difficulty of loss. It insisted on a response to difficulty that left the essential self intact. As his formal education deepened through his teenage years and into his 20s, Marcus encountered the great Stoic teachers of his age. He studied under Apollonius of Chalcedon, a famously rigorous instructor who had been brought to Rome specifically to teach him, and whose combination of emotional self-mastery and intellectual rigor Marcus found genuinely impressive. He studied rhetoric under Marcus Cornelius Fronto, the most celebrated Latin orator of the day, a man so brilliant with words that his students collected his letters the way a later age would collect the letters of famous novelists. The surviving correspondence between Fronto and the young Marcus is one of the genuine pleasures of ancient literature. Fronto teases his student about not writing often enough. Marcus writes back with playful apologies and obvious affection. The warmth and ease of the exchange reveals a dimension of Marcus that his later, more austere reputation tends to obscure entirely. Yet it was Greek philosophy, and Stoicism in particular, that claimed the deepest and most permanent part of him. He studied under Junius Rusticus, a Roman senator who introduced him to the lectures of Epictetus, a former slave who had become one of the greatest Stoic thinkers of the ancient world. Epictetus had lived and taught in roughly the same era as the Apostle Paul, born into slavery, purchased by a cruel master who reportedly broke his leg to demonstrate that physical pain could not touch a truly free mind. Whether or not the specific story is accurate, it captures something essential about Epictetus's philosophy. He had thought harder than almost anyone who'd come before him about the nature of inner freedom, about what it means to be genuinely free in a world where almost everything outside the self is beyond our control. His ideas struck Marcus with the force of a lasting truth that he would carry and test and return to for the rest of his life. The political circumstances that would eventually place Marcus on the imperial throne were set in motion not by any ambition of his own, but by the careful calculation of the Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian, who had no children of his own and who had spent much of his reign traveling the empire and thinking hard about its long-term stability, devoted considerable energy in the last years of his life to arranging a succession that would avoid the chaotic violence that had accompanied so many imperial transitions. The Roman Empire had no settled mechanism for deciding who ruled it next. Blood relationship to the previous emperor gave a claim, adoption gave a claim, military loyalty gave a claim. The result across 2 centuries of imperial history had been an intermittent pattern of civil war and assassination that cost the empire enormously in lives and stability. Hadrian was determined to do something about this if he could. His arrangement involved adopting a respected senator named Titus Aurelius Antoninus, known for his even temperament, his administrative competence, and his broad popularity. But Hadrian attached conditions. Antoninus, who would rule as Antoninus Pius, was required as part of the adoption agreement to adopt 2 young men of his own, ensuring that the succession was planned 2 generations forward. One of those young men was Marcus Annius Verus, the grandson of Hadrian's old friend, the boy he had called Verissimus. The other was a younger boy named Lucius Verus, the son of Hadrian's original first choice for emperor who had died too soon. The arrangement created a dynastic insurance policy, a chain of succession intended to carry the empire through 2 more generations without the instability of an unclear heir. Marcus was 17 years old when this arrangement was formalized in the year 138 AD. Hadrian died shortly afterward, and Antoninus Pius became emperor. Marcus moved into the imperial palace and entered the household of the new emperor, who treated him with genuine affection that appears to have been warmly and genuinely reciprocated. Antoninus was a man of considerable personal integrity, patient, measured, deeply reluctant to use the enormous power at his disposal carelessly or for his own gratification. He would prove to be one of the most effective and least dramatic emperors in Roman history, presiding over nearly 23 years of relative peace and remarkably good government. For Marcus, watching Antoninus from close range for 2 decades was an education in practical governance that no schoolroom could have provided, a daily lesson in the qualities that made power compatible with dignity. The emperor also gave Marcus something even more personal. He gave him his daughter. Marcus became engaged to Faustina, the daughter of Antoninus Pius, and they were married in 145 AD when Marcus was 24 years old. The marriage would last until Faustina's death 30 years later, and it would prove to be one of the central relationships of his life. Ancient gossips, who rarely let facts obstruct a good story, claim that Faustina was unfaithful to him and produced elaborate stories to this effect. Marcus himself gives no indication of believing any of it. He dedicated to Faustina the most tender passage in the Meditations, noting among the things he was grateful for in his life that he had been given a wife of such obedience, affection, and simplicity. The love he felt for her appears from his own writings to have been genuine and deep in a way that his philosophical commitments to emotional self-sufficiency never quite managed to override. Marcus spent the years of Antoninus's reign accumulating the experience of power without yet bearing its full weight. He served as consul twice, the traditional mark of arrival for any serious Roman political career. He sat with Antoninus in meetings of the imperial council, watching how the emperor listened before he spoke, how he weighed advice without being captured by any single advisor, how he managed the constant flow of petitions and complaints and requests that came to him from every corner of the empire. He learned how the machinery of Roman administration actually worked at its highest levels: the provincial reports, the military dispatches, the diplomatic correspondence with foreign kingdoms, the endless legal cases that found their way to the emperor for final judgment. He absorbed all of this with the attention of someone who understood that he was in preparation for a responsibility of enormous weight, and that the preparation would not last forever. Antoninus Pius died in March of 161 AD, quietly and with apparent contentment at the age of 74. His final hours, as recorded by ancient sources, have a quality of serene completeness about them that his admirers found entirely appropriate. He passed the imperial watchword to the duty officer. The word, being equanimity, rolled over and went to sleep. He did not wake up. He had ruled for nearly 23 years and had managed the extraordinary feat of presiding over a peaceful and relatively well-governed empire without generating the kind of dramatic history that later writers found compelling. For the people living under his governance, this was an enormous blessing. Stability, competent administration, and the absence of catastrophe are, for the people who actually have to live through them, far preferable to the dramatic disasters that fill the history books. The absence of drama was itself an achievement. Marcus became emperor immediately upon Antoninus's death. But he did something at the very start of his reign that was almost entirely without precedent in the history of the empire. He insisted that his adoptive brother Lucius Verus be elevated to co-emperor alongside him, sharing fully in the powers and titles of the principate. This was not legally required. The Senate had confirmed Marcus alone. The armies had sworn their oaths to Marcus. He could have given Lucius a senior title and significant responsibilities without making him an equal partner in the supreme power. He chose not to. The arrangement he insisted on was one of genuine shared authority, and the explanation he gave was principled. This had been Hadrian's intention. This was what fairness required, and it was therefore what would happen. The Roman Senate, confused but willing to comply with an emperor who seemed determined to be scrupulously fair, even about the distribution of his own power, confirmed both men in their roles. The empire they inherited was vast, complex, and already showing the first signs of the stresses that would eventually overwhelm it, though that overwhelm would not come for another 3 centuries. For now, it still functioned with remarkable efficiency. The road network was the best the ancient world had ever produced, connecting roughly 40,000 miles of paved highway that allowed armies to move, information to travel, and trade to flow at speeds unmatched until the modern era. The legal system, developed and refined over centuries of increasingly sophisticated jurisprudence, provided a degree of civil order across an enormous and culturally diverse territory that was one of the genuine wonders of the ancient world. The grain dole in Rome kept the urban poor fed and relatively quiescent. The engineering infrastructure, the aqueducts and harbours and bridges and drainage systems, was in most places still well maintained. Running all of this required constant attention, enormous reserves of energy, and a willingness to make difficult decisions with imperfect information under time pressure, every single day, without respite. From almost the first days of his reign, Marcus found himself making exactly those decisions. The Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival to the east, launched a major invasion of the Roman province of Armenia in 161 AD, the same year Marcus took power. The Parthians were a sophisticated civilization occupying the territory of modern-day Iran and Iraq, governed by a royal dynasty that had maintained its independence against Rome for 2 centuries through a combination of military skill, diplomatic cunning, and the vast distances that made sustained Roman campaigns in their territory enormously difficult to supply and sustain. Their heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, heavily armoured men on heavily armoured horses, were among the most formidable soldiers in the ancient world, capable of shattering infantry formations and outrunning lighter opponents with alarming ease. Roman armies in the east were defeated in the opening engagements, and the situation was serious enough to require Marcus's full attention from the very beginning of his reign. He sent Lucius Verus to take command of the eastern campaign, surrounding him with experienced generals including Avidius Cassius and Martius Verus, who could provide the military expertise that the inexperienced Lucius lacked. The decision was diplomatically elegant in the way that many of Marcus's decisions were elegant without being showy. It gave Lucius a significant and public role while ensuring that the actual direction of military operations was in the hands of professionals who had spent their careers doing exactly this kind of work. The Eastern War occupied much of the 160s AD and ultimately resulted in Roman victory. Armenia was secured. Large parts of Mesopotamia were invaded. The Parthian capital of Ctesiphon was sacked. A reasonable peace was established, but the returning armies brought something back with them that would prove more destructive than any military defeat. The Antonine Plague swept through the empire beginning around 165 AD, killing people in enormous numbers across a span of years that seemed to have no end. The physician Galen, who was working in Rome during the outbreak and left detailed accounts of what he observed, described symptoms including high fever, diarrhea, and skin eruptions, descriptions that have led most modern scholars to identify the disease as smallpox, though some have argued for measles or a hemorrhagic fever. Whatever it was lethal and persistent in a way that even the Romans, accustomed to endemic disease in a world without germ theory or effective quarantine, found catastrophic. It killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people across the empire over the course of its various outbreaks. It disrupted agriculture, depleted the legions, undermined the tax base, and created shortages across the supply chains that kept the empire functioning. Marcus managed the crisis as best he could, but no management could make it not happen. Marcus had barely begun to manage the aftermath of the Eastern War and the catastrophic plague when the northern frontier collapsed under pressure. The Germanic tribes along the Danube, a shifting and complex collection of peoples, including the Marcomanni, Quadi, Sarmatians and others, launched a massive and to some degree coordinated incursion into Roman territory, beginning in 166 and 167 AD. These were not the small border raids that Roman frontier forces dealt with as a matter of routine. These were large-scale movements of organized populations, entire peoples crossing the Danube in numbers that overwhelmed local defenses. For the first time in nearly 3 centuries, Germanic warriors reached the town of Aquileia in northeastern Italy, within striking distance of the heartland of Roman civilization. The shock to Roman public confidence was profound and lasting. Marcus responded with everything the empire could mobilize. He raised money for additional troops by selling off imperial treasures at public auction, including furniture and artworks from the palace itself, rather than imposing additional taxation on already plague-stressed populations who could barely sustain the existing burden. He reformed the legions and recruited from groups who had not previously served in the Roman military, including gladiators, freed slaves, bandits who were offered pardons in exchange for service, and Germanic tribesmen who could be redirected from raiding Rome to fighting for it. He raised two entirely new legions, the Legio II Italica and the Legio III Italica, something that had not been done for generations. These were the actions of a man who was willing to do whatever the situation required, without sentiment and without pride, and then deal with the philosophical implications afterward. He personally led the northern campaigns for much of the rest of his reign, spending years at a time on the Danube frontier rather than in the administrative comfort of Rome. This was a man who loved books and philosophy and the company of educated friends who found large crowds exhausting and military ceremonies tedious by temperament, who had spent his entire adult life in the cultivated environment of the Roman aristocracy and the imperial palace. Now he was living in military camps along a cold and often fog-shrouded river at the northern edge of the civilized world, sleeping under canvas in temperatures that dropped well below freezing in winter, eating soldiers' food, and making the daily operational decisions of a prolonged border war. He did not enjoy it in any straightforward sense. He did it because it was what the situation required, and because his deepest beliefs told him that the job of the emperor was to serve the empire, not the other way around. The Marcomannic Wars were among the most sustained military efforts in the history of the empire. They involved multiple phases spread across more than a decade, repeated crossings of the Danube into Germanic territory, the defeat of numerous tribal confederations, complex and often fragile diplomatic arrangements with dozens of different chieftains, the establishment of new frontier fortifications, and the slow, grinding work of preventing hard-won gains from being lost in the following campaign season. It was exactly the kind of prolonged, unglamorous, strategically necessary but individually exhausting work that Marcus's Stoic philosophy had actually prepared him for better than any military training could have. You cannot win wars like this through bursts of heroic effort. You win them through consistency, endurance, clear thinking under pressure, and the absolute refusal to give up when the situation becomes difficult. Marcus had spent 20 years practicing exactly those qualities. It was during these campaigns in the military camps of what is now Austria and Slovakia and Hungary that Marcus wrote the private journal that the world now calls the Meditations. He wrote in Greek, the language of philosophy, not in Latin, the language of Roman power and administration. He was not writing for an audience. There is no evidence that he intended these notes to be read by anyone other than himself, and there is considerable evidence in the tone and content of the writing that he was operating on the assumption of complete privacy, the kind of privacy that allows a person to be honest in ways that public performance never permits. They were a form of daily self-examination, a philosopher's workout in which Marcus held his own thoughts and behaviors up to scrutiny against the standards of his philosophy and pushed himself to do better. The contrast between where he was physically writing and what he was writing about is one of the most striking juxtapositions in all of ancient literature. Military camp, frozen frontier, the language of inner peace. To understand Marcus Aurelius, it is essential to understand the Stoic philosophy that structured his entire inner life. He did not treat Stoicism as an intellectual hobby or a set of impressive ideas to deploy in conversations with people he wanted to impress. He treated it as a practical technology for living, a discipline that had to be exercised daily, especially in the most difficult circumstances, or it meant nothing at all. The version of Stoicism that Marcus had absorbed from Epictetus and from his other teachers and had developed through his own decades of reflection and practice had several key pillars that appear again and again throughout his private writings, approached from different angles, tested against his current experience, and restated in fresh language as if he needed to encounter them new each morning. The first was the distinction between what is in our control and what is not. Marcus returned to this idea constantly in dozens of different formulations across the 12 books of the Meditations. Our own judgments, intentions, desires and responses are within our control. Everything in the external world, other people's behavior, the outbreak of plagues, the invasions of foreign armies, the deaths of children, the ingratitude of those we have helped, the passage of time that takes everything eventually is not within our control. This was not a counsel of passivity or resignation in the face of difficulty. Marcus was not suggesting that we should do nothing about the things that go wrong in the external world. He remained an energetic and engaged emperor until the last weeks of his life. But he believed with deep conviction that our fundamental well-being, the peace and stability of our inner life, should not be held hostage to outcomes we cannot guarantee. The equanimity he sought was not indifference, but something more like a steady relationship with uncertainty. The second pillar was the concept of universal reason, what the Stoics called the logos, the rational principle that they believed pervaded and structured the entire universe. Marcus believed that the cosmos was a single, rational organism, governed by a divine intelligence that gave it order and purpose, and that human beings, uniquely among earthly creatures, participated in this universal reason through their capacity for rational thought. The implication he drew from this was profoundly egalitarian. Every human being, regardless of their social status, their nationality, their intelligence, or even their moral failures, was a fellow rational creature deserving of patience and consideration rather than contempt. He reminded himself of this when dealing with people who had betrayed him, when managing subordinates who were incompetent or lazy, when facing critics who were unfair. He found it one of the hardest principles to apply consistently and returned to it more often than almost any other. He also wrote extensively about a meditative practice he called the view from above, the deliberate habit of imagining oneself looking down at human life from a great height and seeing its ordinary competitions and fierce passions in their true scale. He describes looking down at the whole Roman world with all its busyness and conflict and struggle and seeing something resembling an ant-hill, each creature furiously purposeful in its small radius, unaware of the vastness surrounding it. This was not meant to produce contempt for human effort. It was meant to correct the distortions that come from being too close to our own concerns. From far enough away, the petty argument with a colleague and the conquest of a province look equally temporary. The adjustment of perspective could, Marcus believed, dissolve many of the passions that most disturbed his judgment and interfered with his ability to act well. The Meditations are not a systematic philosophical treatise developed as an argument from premises to conclusions. They are notes to himself, often repetitive, occasionally contradictory, always intensely personal and practical in their orientation. He reminds himself again and again to get up promptly in the morning rather than lying in bed enjoying the warmth when there is work to do. He lectures himself about losing his temper with people who behave badly and who do not understand why their behavior is bad. He argues himself out of resentment toward those who have wronged him by reminding himself that their wrongs came from ignorance rather than malice. He reminds himself that everything passes, that fame is temporary, that emperors and empires alike will be forgotten, and that the only thing worth caring about in the present moment is whether he is acting rightly in accordance with his nature as a rational and social creature. Reading them across 20 centuries, it is impossible not to feel the presence of a real person struggling honestly with real difficulties. It would be a serious mistake to read Marcus Aurelius as a saint, or to imagine that his philosophical beliefs produced in him a serene, effortless virtue that flowed naturally and without struggle from his character. The Meditations themselves testify powerfully against this reading. He is constantly struggling. He records his frustration with people who talk too much and say too little, his impatience with the flattery that surrounded him on all sides and that he could see through but that still somehow managed to irritate him, his difficulty in not becoming angry when he is treated with ingratitude or dishonesty by people he has tried to treat well. He notes again and again the gap between how he knows he should behave as a Stoic philosopher and how he actually sometimes does behave as a tired and frustrated human being. The whole point of the private journal was to give himself an honest accounting of his failures and to recommit every single day to doing better. He was an intensely conscientious administrator, driven by a genuine and not merely performed belief that the emperor existed to serve the people over whom he ruled, rather than to exploit them for his own benefit or pleasure. He spent enormous amounts of time personally hearing legal cases, often working deep into the night to clear backlogs that had accumulated before his reign or that developed faster than his court could handle them. He reformed the laws governing the treatment of slaves, requiring that owners who abused their slaves be subject to legal penalty, a reform with no obvious political benefit to him and considerable political cost among the wealthy slave-owning class whose support any emperor needed. He extended legal protections to orphans and to the poor who found it difficult to access the courts. He took seriously, in ways that his predecessors had not always done, the idea that the power of the emperor was a form of public trust rather than a private privilege. His response to natural disasters and crises also reflects this understanding of imperial responsibility. When floods damaged the Tiber Valley and destroyed crops, Marcus organized relief. When the plague disrupted food supplies, he managed distribution of grain reserves. When provincial governors sent requests for additional resources to manage local emergencies, he responded with more speed and more generosity than the imperial bureaucracy had typically shown before his time. These were not dramatic or glamorous acts. They were the daily labor of a man who believed that good government was about outcomes for actual people rather than about the performance of authority. The ancient sources who record these actions do so almost in passing, as if they were simply what you would expect from a good emperor. That very expectedness is itself a tribute to how thoroughly Marcus had established a standard. He also made time, always, for philosophy. Even in the worst years of the Marcomannic Wars, even on the most difficult campaigns along the Danube frontier, Marcus found time to read, to write, to correspond with educated friends about ideas that had nothing directly to do with military operations or administrative decisions. He maintained his friendships with philosophers and men of letters across the empire. He continued the conversations that had formed him as a young man, arguing about the nature of the good and the right way to live with the same intensity and seriousness that he had brought to these questions as a teenager sleeping on a hard board in imitation of the great Stoic teachers. Philosophy was not a luxury for Marcus to be indulged when the urgent work was done. It was the work. It was what made everything else possible. The death of Lucius Verus in 169 AD, apparently from a stroke or some sudden illness contracted while they were traveling together near the Danube, left Marcus as the sole emperor. Lucius had been a very different personality from his co-ruler. He was more interested in pleasure than in philosophy, genuinely fond of the spectacle and entertainment that Rome offered in abundance, not particularly diligent about the daily demands of governance, which tended to be handled by the staff around him while he focused on the more enjoyable aspects of imperial life. Ancient sources, who tended to measure all emperors against the very high standard set by Marcus, were not kind to Lucius in retrospect. But Marcus had genuinely liked him, had compensated for his weaknesses through his own additional attention to the business of government, and had treated him as a full partner in public throughout their shared reign. His death simplified the governmental structure and removed the one person on earth who had shared the burden of the purple with him. The crisis that came in 175 AD was one of the most dramatic of the entire reign. In the east, a general named Avidius Cassius declared himself emperor. Cassius was not a minor figure. He was a highly experienced and genuinely respected commander who had played a central role in the Parthian Wars and who had spent years managing the complex politics of the eastern frontier with considerable skill. He had been granted exceptional powers over the eastern provinces by Marcus himself, a delegation of authority that reflected the emperor's trust and that Cassius now turned against the man who had given it to him. The most plausible explanation for the rebellion is that a false report reached Cassius claiming that Marcus had died, and that Cassius, calculating that a swift move was necessary to secure the throne before a less sympathetic emperor could be installed, declared himself before the truth became clear. By the time he discovered his error, the declaration had been made and could not easily be unmade. Marcus's response was characteristically measured. He abandoned the Danube campaign, which had been going well, and moved east with his forces. But he sent messages ahead, making clear that he wanted Cassius taken alive and unharmed, if at all possible. He wished to understand how the rebellion had arisen, and he intended no general purge of those who had supported the usurper. His stated hope was to demonstrate that a civil war could be concluded with forgiveness, rather than with the massive reprisals that normally followed a defeated rebellion in the Roman world. He never got the chance to carry this out. Before Marcus could reach him, Cassius was assassinated by one of his own centurions, who apparently calculated that returning the head of the rebel to the legitimate emperor was a better survival strategy than continuing a lost cause. The rebellion had lasted 3 months and 22 days. The letters and messages that Cassius had sent to various senators and officials in Rome were seized and brought to Marcus. He refused to read them. He had them burned unread, explaining publicly that he did not wish to know who had corresponded with the rebel and thereby be tempted to treat them as enemies who required punishment. Whether this was genuine principle or shrewd politics, or some combination of both that Marcus himself could not entirely disentangle, is impossible to say with certainty. What is clear is that the purge and reprisals that usually followed a defeated usurpation did not happen on any significant scale. The officials who had offered their support to Cassius were left largely in place. Marcus moved through the eastern provinces, addressing local grievances and making the kind of administrative adjustments that were needed after years of war, and then returned to Rome for a triumph he had not sought and did not particularly want. There is one dimension of Marcus Aurelius's reign that historians have found consistently difficult to reconcile with his philosophical reputation, and it is impossible to discuss his legacy honestly without confronting it. Marcus was a committed Stoic who believed in the rational unity of all human beings and the fundamental equality of all rational creatures as participants in the universal logos. He also presided over, and appears not to have actively intervened to prevent, the persecution of Christians in several provinces of the Roman Empire. It is established that Christians were tried and executed in Gaul, in Asia Minor, and elsewhere during his reign, and that the most famous of these cases, the Martyrs of Lyon in 177 AD, appears to have reached his direct attention without producing any imperial response that protected the condemned. The apparent contradiction between his philosophical universalism and his tolerance of religious persecution has troubled his admirers for centuries. The most sympathetic interpretation, and it has real merit as an argument, is that Marcus's understanding of Christianity was probably superficial and coloured by the hostile characterizations offered by educated Roman contemporaries, who tended to view the early Christians through a lens of social suspicion rather than philosophical curiosity. They were seen as a secretive sect resistant to the public religious ceremonies that held Roman civic life together and capable in the fevered imagination of their enemies of crimes ranging from cannibalism to political sedition. Marcus, who respected sincere philosophical seeking of all kinds, does not seem to have recognized the early Christians as the kind of seekers he would have respected. His one reference to Christians in the Meditations is brief, dismissive, and unfair. This does not excuse him, but it may help to explain him. The other shadow over his legacy is the decision he made about his succession. Marcus broke with the principle that had shaped his own path to power. Rather than selecting the most capable available candidate, as Hadrian had done, and as Antoninus had done, he designated his own biological son, Commodus, as his heir, elevating him to co-emperor in 177 AD and ensuring the succession despite widespread private doubts about Commodus's suitability. Commodus was 17 when he became co-emperor. He was energetic and physically impressive, trained as his father had been in the traditional aristocratic disciplines, but without his father's intellectual curiosity, his patience, or his genuine commitment to the idea that power was a responsibility rather than a privilege. Marcus seems to have known this at some level. Some ancient sources suggest he had doubts that he pushed aside. The Meditations characteristically are silent on the subject of Commodus entirely. What we know is the result. Commodus would rule for 12 years after his father's death and would manage to undermine almost everything Marcus had built, not through military defeat or administrative collapse, but through the sheer relentless energy of his self-absorption. He renamed himself Hercules Romanus. He renamed Rome after himself. He spent his time in the gladiatorial arena fighting as a performer, an activity that the Roman upper class regarded as deeply degrading, and that Commodus pursued with apparent genuine enthusiasm regardless. He was eventually strangled in his bath on the final day of 192 AD by a conspiracy of his own household, and it is a measure of how far the empire had deteriorated during his reign that the news of his death was received with widespread relief rather than grief. The contrast with his father was so stark that it became almost a philosophical example in itself. What happens when power is divorced entirely from the sense of responsibility that Marcus had spent his life trying to cultivate? The last years of Marcus Aurelius's life were spent exactly where the middle years had been spent, on the Danube frontier, fighting the wars that never quite concluded to a definitive resolution. The peace settlement that had ended the first major phase of the Marcomannic Wars had not held with the stability Marcus had hoped for. Germanic pressure on the northern border was a structural feature of late 2nd century Roman life, driven by population movements and ecological pressures far to the east that rippled westward in ways the Romans could observe in their effects, but could not understand in their causes. By the late 170s, it was clear that another major military effort was needed to achieve the kind of lasting settlement that the frontier required. Marcus launched what he intended to be a final and decisive series of campaigns aimed at pushing the frontier definitively north of the Danube, potentially incorporating large territories in what we now call the Czech Republic and Slovakia into the empire as new provinces to be called Marcomannia and Sarmatia. This was an ambitious strategic plan, and there are serious historians who argue it might have succeeded, that a Roman province north of the Danube would have significantly altered the long-term trajectory of European history by providing the kind of deep strategic buffer that the existing frontier chronically lacked. The campaigns were going reasonably well by the winter of 179 into 180 AD. The enemy was pressed back. New fortifications were established. Diplomatic arrangements with some tribal leaders were holding. The end might actually have been in sight. Marcus led these final campaigns in person, despite being, by this point, a man in his late 50s whose health had been compromised by decades of difficulty. He had apparently suffered throughout much of his adult life from a weak constitution that manifested in chronic stomach complaints and chest problems that his physicians treated with theriac, a compound medicine of the period that contained among its many ingredients a small amount of opium. He ate sparingly, slept badly, and drove himself with a relentlessness that his staff found admirable and alarming in roughly equal measure. The military camps of the Danube were difficult enough for vigorous young soldiers. For a man of Marcus's age and constitution, spending winter after winter in these conditions was an act of sustained physical sacrifice in service of a responsibility he had not chosen but had never tried to avoid. In the spring of 180 AD, somewhere in the frontier region near the legionary fortress of Vindobona, which is now the city of Vienna, Marcus Aurelius fell seriously ill. The nature of the illness is not precisely recorded, though many ancient sources speak of a pestilence, suggesting a recurrence of the plague that had haunted the empire for 15 years. He had time to arrange the final handover of authority to Commodus, whom he summoned and charged with continuing the northern campaigns and maintaining the border defences. He asked his friends and advisers to take care of the young emperor who was to follow him, a request that suggests he was under no illusions about what Commodus was and what he would need. He declined food and drink in the final days, apparently making a deliberate choice to hasten the end rather than prolong a life that was already effectively over. He died on the 17th of March in 180 AD. He was 58 years old. The physical monuments of Marcus Aurelius's reign are scattered across Rome and beyond, remnants of an empire that measured its achievements in stone and bronze. The column of Marcus Aurelius still stands in the Piazza Colonna in Rome. Its spiral relief carvings depicting scenes from the Marcomannic Wars with a documentary intensity and dramatic energy that makes it one of the most remarkable historical records of any ancient military campaign. The column was modelled on the column of Trajan erected a few decades earlier to celebrate that emperor's victories in Dacia, but Marcus's column has a different quality. Where Trajan's column is triumphant and celebratory, Marcus's is almost elegiac, filled with suffering and effort alongside whatever victory was achieved. It is a monument to the cost of war rather than to its glory, which seems entirely appropriate for the man who commissioned it. The equestrian statue of Marcus that once stood prominently in Rome, mistakenly identified through the medieval period as a statue of the Christian Emperor Constantine, and thereby spared the melting down that destroyed virtually every other ancient bronze of comparable scale, now stands inside the Capitoline museums. Its surface is worn by centuries, but the subject is entirely unmistakable. A man on horseback extending his right hand in a gesture that can be read simultaneously as command and as mercy, as the authority to direct and the authority to pardon. Whether this was the sculptor's conscious intention or simply the ambiguity inherent in the gesture, it captures something essential about Marcus and about the complicated relationship between power and the people who try to wield it responsibly. A hand extended in command, a hand extended in offering. But these physical remains are not the reason Marcus Aurelius continues to matter across 2,000 years of intervening history. The reason is the small notebook of private reflections, the work he never intended to publish, and almost certainly never showed to anyone, written in a language that was not the language of his government, structured as notes to himself rather than arguments for an audience. The Meditations survived through a chain of manuscript copying whose full details we cannot reconstruct, eventually emerging into the modern era as one of the most widely read philosophical texts in any language. They have been translated into virtually every major language on Earth. They have been read in hospital wards by people facing their own mortality, and in offices by people trying to maintain their integrity under professional pressure. They have been carried into military campaigns by officers who found in them a discipline applicable to conditions of stress that Marcus himself would have recognized immediately and completely. The enduring appeal of the Meditations is not difficult to understand once you have spent time with them. They are honest in a way that formal philosophical works almost never manage. Marcus is not performing wisdom for an audience. He is attempting wisdom for himself, failing at it, recommitting to it, returning to the same ideas again and again from slightly different angles because he has not yet managed to make them fully operative in his own daily behavior. He is the most powerful man in the world telling himself, in private, that he needs to do better. There is something in this combination of very high aspiration and very human imperfection that speaks across centuries without requiring any special knowledge of Roman history or Stoic philosophy to be felt. The gap between what we know we should do and what we actually manage to do is one of the most universal features of human experience. Marcus did not solve it. He kept working on it every day. There is a question that runs through the Meditations like a thread woven through a length of cloth, never fully resolved, always returned to, which is simply this: how do you remain a good person when the world makes it very difficult? Marcus was not asking this question from the comfortable position of someone for whom goodness was easy or natural. He was asking it as a man surrounded by flattery and by the corrupting presence of unlimited power, wearied by endless war, grieving for children he had buried, governing an empire full of people who wanted things from him and were often dishonest in how they pursued those wants. He was asking it as someone who had real temptations available to him at every moment, to punish freely when he was angry, to indulge freely when he was exhausted, to stop trying when the effort seemed disproportionate to any achievable result. The Meditations are the record of his daily refusal to stop trying. He returned often to the image of the sun, which shines on the world without asking for gratitude and without becoming depleted by what it gives. He wanted to be like that, to do good without needing recognition for it, to serve without requiring the service to be noticed or appreciated, to act well because that was simply what a rational creature did when it understood itself clearly and honestly. He wanted his goodness to be structural rather than reactive, built into his character at such a deep level that it operated automatically rather than requiring constant conscious effort. He never achieved this. He knew he never achieved it. But he kept trying, and the trying is itself one of the most remarkable things about him, because it continued under conditions that would have defeated most people's moral ambitions entirely. The philosophical tradition he represented has had a long and varied afterlife that he could not have predicted and would probably have regarded with amused skepticism if he somehow could have known about it. Stoicism, which gradually disappeared as a formal school of philosophy after the rise of Christianity, found new readers in the Renaissance and has found an even larger audience in the 21st century, where the pace and complexity of contemporary life generates precisely the kinds of anxiety that Stoic techniques were designed to address. Modern practitioners of cognitive behavioral therapy have noted the structural similarities between CBT techniques and Stoic exercises, particularly the practice of identifying irrational beliefs and replacing them with more realistic assessments. The self-help tradition has drawn extensively on Stoic ideas, sometimes with genuine insight and sometimes with a superficiality that Marcus himself would have found irritating. But the core ideas survive and travel, which is more than most philosophical systems manage. Marcus Aurelius has been called the last of the 5 good emperors, a run of rulers that ancient and modern historians alike have identified as Rome at something close to its best. The philosopher Plato had written, centuries before Rome existed, that the ideal state would only be achievable when philosophers became kings or kings became philosophers. Most serious readers of Plato treat this as an attractive but essentially unrealizable dream. Marcus Aurelius is the closest thing the historical record has ever produced to a serious test of whether the dream was possible. He was not perfect. His reign had genuine darkness, but he was, genuinely and documentably, a person who tried every single day to make the exercise of power compatible with the demands of philosophy and with the requirements of basic human decency. He tried it in private. He tried it in public. He tried it in military camps at the edge of the world when no one was watching, and there was nothing to gain from trying except the private satisfaction of having done so. There is a passage near the beginning of the Meditations, in the section where Marcus lists the things he is grateful to have learned from the people who shaped him, that contains a detail so small and so human that it tends to stop readers in their tracks. He works through a long list of virtues acquired from the people who raised and educated him. From his grandfather, gentleness and meekness. From his mother, piety and beneficence and the discipline to live simply despite great wealth. From his adoptive father, endurance and patience and equanimity in the face of everything the world chose to send. And then, buried among these large and important virtues, he notes that from one of his teachers he learned to read carefully and not be satisfied with a superficial understanding of things. It is such a small thing to carry through 20 centuries. And yet, something about it feels like the whole man. Careful, thorough, never quite satisfied with where he has got to, always reaching for a slightly clearer understanding of what is actually there. The sounds of the camp are quieter now. The fires along the riverbank are burning low, reduced to red coals that give heat without flame. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the tent walls, the Danube moves through its ancient course, indifferent to empires and the ambitions of the people who live along its banks, carrying the cold water of the Alps steadily southward toward a sea it will reach with or without any human involvement. The soldiers are sleeping in their quarters, the sentries walk their rounds in the cold dark. Tomorrow there will be dispatches to read and decisions to make and troops to command and diplomatic letters to compose, and somewhere in the margins of all of it, perhaps in the grey hours before the camp fully wakes, a few minutes to write down what he is thinking, what he is failing at, what he hopes to do differently, and why any of it matters at all. The pen is already in his hand. The notebook is already open on the desk. And that, perhaps, is exactly where we should leave him. Not on a throne receiving the obedience of the most powerful empire on earth, not at the head of a victorious army on the north bank of a frozen river, but alone with his thoughts and his honesty and his absolute refusal to stop trying. One of the most powerful men who ever lived, insisting quietly to himself in a language no one around him was reading. That power was not enough. That comfort was not enough. That success was not enough. That the good opinion of the world was not enough. That the only thing that would ever be enough was to actually become, in whatever small and imperfect and daily way the hours allowed, the kind of person he had always believed a human being could be. The kind of person, as he knew perfectly well, he had not quite managed to become yet. The kind of person he intended to try again tomorrow. Thank you for listening. Good night and sleep well.